Okay, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. We'll be doing chapter or era 6 and 7 in this video, inshallah. Stage 6 was the era of the taqlid, so the uncritical following. It started with the stagnation period and then the decline. So it's really divided into three main periods. So the first was started from the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols until the fall of Muslim Spain. The second period was from the conquest of Constantinople until the start of the European invasion, and then the third from the beginning of European colonialism until the fall of the Islamic Khilafah. Okay. Characteristics of this stage are that there was the dominance of taqlid. Because the people were governed through so many wars, people had little interest in gaining knowledge, and so they were more encouraged to just follow the previous scholars without really thinking about it, just for convenience. There's also more sectarianism between the madhab and more rivalry, like we sort of alluded to before. The Mongols converted to Islam. There were frequent clashes with Christendom, and then there was a loss of Islamic territories for the Europeans. Okay, so factors that affected fiqh during this time, there was a loss of great resources of knowledge, as for example, like the fact that the libraries in Baghdad were lost. A lot of knowledge was lost that way, unfortunately. There's also the cancellation of ijtihad and more prevalence of taqlid, again, like I said before. And then there's also growing popularity of books that were called mukhtasarat, which are like abridged versions of fiqh. Unfortunately, they were so abridged that sometimes people would just butcher the language, and it would become like a series of riddles that then would require greater commentary to explain them because they were just way too abbreviated. This is also the period when there were earlier attempts to reform the fiqh, but they were shut down. And then there was more and more European law established in Muslim lands, and so this made it more difficult for Muslims to practice their religion. So much so that they were sort of persecuted if they tried to practice their religion openly, and so oftentimes they came up with different methods, for example, of making wudu secretly, or to make salah in a private way so that people wouldn't notice, because it was so dangerous to practice their religion. People also started to establish madaris and katatibs by going out to the desert and establishing these schools out there just to try to preserve their Muslim identity as much as possible. It was unfortunately not sufficient, but it was the best that they could do at that time. So the difference between ijtihad and taqlid. So to review this again, ijtihad is the process of independent research in fiqh when you make opinions by going back to the sources of law, and then taqlid is just the uncritical following of a qualified person. Ittiba is sort of between these two things, which is the critical following of a qualified person. So they make an educated decision based on, the opinion of someone that's qualified. Okay, so some scholars of taqlid say that no one should do ittiba because the average Muslim doesn't have enough knowledge to make that decision to be critical of the qualified people. But the more we know, obviously, the more educated decision we can make. A lot of people in America now are kind of fall under that critical follower category because they ask a lot of questions to our qualified scholars. So when you give people the option of only doing taqlid, they become subjected more to the fuqaha and to the scholars than to Allah. And then when they start doing more attiba, they become subject more to Allah and less to the scholars. Okay, so then this brings us to the question, are we obliged to adhere to a particular madhab? Well, the answer is that it sort of depends. So if the person's educated enough to make their own decisions, they can do that through the process of attiba. But if they're a layman, then it's probably best to sort of follow the opinion of somebody that's qualified. And then lastly, if you are an academic or a student and you want to study fiqh, it's best to start with one madhab, and in particular you should start with the one that's geographically closest to you, so that you have the most resources to study it. So for example, if you're in Pakistan, it would make most sense to study the Hanafi school because the resources would be of greatest availability to you. I'm going to skip the prominent fuqaha at this stage because it's a long list that I didn't think would be particularly useful for me to just list off, but you can go over those on your own time. So moving on to stage 7 is the Reformation Era. So this is the period that we are in today. It started with the European invasions of the Muslim lands when they removed Sharia and caused a lot of chaos. As we talked about, they sort of just took maps and drew straight lines to create borders and not paying attention to any of the natural borders, and so as a result they split up a lot of Muslim lands and and split up a lot of ethnic groups and created a lot of conflict through that, which is probably deliberate on their part. So the characteristics of this stage is that there's an absence of a central Islamic government. There's also kind of this battle between secularism versus Islamism, which we still see today. There's been a lot of Islamic movements through politics, but unfortunately there's no nation state today that now is purely ruled by Islamic law, and a lot of countries just sort of pick and choose what's convenient for them. And there's also been the establishment of more nation states, more globalization, and then the establishment of Muslim minorities in the West. So this never happened before in history, where Muslims voluntarily moved to non-Muslim lands. This is kind of a new phenomenon and has led to a lot of new fiqh departments actually that talk specifically about the fiqh of minorities. First of all, there's the establishment of the Islamic Fiqh Academy, which is a new thing, and it sort of brings nation states together to discuss matters of fiqh and law, and they produce annual reports about contemporary issues that can be really useful to us. There's also been more academia and more establishment of Islamic universities, which is in contrast to the traditional method of learning Islam, which has become more and more rare. Also, comparative fiqh studies are becoming more common, especially living in a place like America, which has such a diverse Muslim population. Studying one particular madhab is not as easily a reality because we're so diverse. It's more important to do the comparative studies. There's also been an increase of literacy in the internet. As a result, the spread of knowledge has become very quick and easy, but unfortunately the quality has been declining, and often the quality of the students in turn has declined as well. So we should make an effort to sort of preserve the classical knowledge and build on it. There's been more pressure on modernizing fiqh and usul. People want to sort of change the way that we view our Islam and how we come up with fiqh rulings, which is a little bit of a challenge. And then so there's been, the Ummah has more or less been divided into two groups, which is the rational school and the traditional school, based on their approach to these issues. So fiqh and fatwa today, a lot of people unfortunately don't have a lot of respect for fiqh and sharia as much as they used to. People often think that they can give their own fatwas without the proper education or qualifications. Often when people do need to obtain a fiqh opinion, they are more inclined to just call out to a celebrity imam that they found out about on the internet. But what's more appropriate is actually that you should seek out your local scholars, even if they aren't well known. It's more appropriate to seek out the local people first before going outside of your community. And then we talked about how we should be working to gain knowledge today. So if we don't have qualified people in our community, we should be trying to take online classes even to structure the way we learn and to teach us the limits of our knowledge. And with Sheikh Yasir just told us that there are two things that will deprive us from knowledge, and they are arrogance and bashfulness. So inshallah, we should make an effort to avoid both of these two extremes and go in the middle. Okay. So that is the end of this book, inshallah, and the end of our review series. Hope these review videos were helpful to you. Inshallah, the exam goes well for everybody. Barakallahu.